Welcome back to Click Revision and our last video focusing on an inspector calls. This video is called Structure, Meaning and Ambiguity, which is a big jumble of words, but really it's about the choices made by J.B. Priestley while he was writing the play, how he put it all together, and most importantly, what he chose to tell and not tell his audience. We'll look at the order the events occur in the narrative, and some of the structural features that hold the play together. Finally, we'll look at what it all might mean, which isn't a straightforward question at all. But let's start by looking at how the play is structured, and in order to do this, we're going to look at some of the events of the play. However, it's important to note that when you're writing in your exam, you should try as much as possible not to just repeat the play's narrative. It will just make your writing read like a shopping list, and it won't show the understanding you need to demonstrate to hit the high grade you deserve. You can safely assume that whoever is reading your exam paper will have already read or seen the play and will know what you're talking about, so don't feel that you need to give a blow-by-blow account of everything that happens. Anyway, at the start of an inspector calls, the curtains open and we're in the Burlings' dining room. At this point, the stage directions tell us the lighting is pink and intimate, so it's a warm environment, and as an audience member, you're kind of standing at the window looking in on how this wealthy, decadent family lives its life. The Burlings have finished dinner. Their maid is cleaning up the scraps, and Burling is lecturing everyone on what the future holds and how everyone should treat each other. He's absolutely certain about everything he says, but wrong on pretty much every count. And it's exactly this point when the inspector arrives. The stage directions tell us that Burling is interrupted by the doorbell, just as he is telling everyone that a man has to mind his own business and look after himself. At this point, the Burlings' lives are about to be turned upside down. Their happy celebration is over, and the house on stage responds accordingly. The lighting goes from pink to brighter and harder the moment the inspector arrives, and stays that way until he leaves. The stage now looks colder and less friendly. The characters are literally under the spotlight, and the bright lights are adding to the inspector's techniques to give a sense of the interrogation. So, the inspector interviews each family member in turn, and this forms the main structure of the play. In the first act, he interviews Mr. Burling and Sheila. In the second act, he interrogates Gerald and Mrs. Burling, and in the final act, he speaks to Eric, and then leaves the family to fight among themselves and argue who is the most to blame if there's anything to feel blame for at all. Now this is the basic structure, but there is more going on than that. For example, each act ends with a cliffhanger, which is beautifully orchestrated by the inspector, and each is chosen by Priestley as a blackout moment because it represents one of the dramatic high points, the most suspenseful moments in the play. Firstly, at the end of Act 1, the inspector slips out of the room so Sheila can make Gerald confess, and he walks back in just at the point when Gerald is saying they should lie, and Sheila is telling him not to bother. Act 2 begins with the same line that ends Act 1, as though time has frozen while the curtain's been closed. This happens again at the end of Act 2. Here the family has just realised that Eric is the father of the dead girl's child, and the curtains have closed, freezing time, just as he's walked back into the house ready to tell them everything. The final cliffhanger occurs right at the end of the play, long after the inspector has left, but it's clearly still part of his plan. With the inspector gone, the lighting back to its original pink state, and the security of their home restored, the older Burlings and Gerald spend the last portion of the play rebuilding the safe world they live in by dismissing everything the inspector has said to them. Then the phone rings, and the play closes with the revelation that there is a girl in the morgue, and that by inquiring about something so obscure as a female bleach suicide, Gerald has incriminated himself and the rest of the Burlings. It's a huge cliffhanger, which forces the Burlings and the audience to question everything that they have seen throughout the evening. It also means, by extension, that the family are going to have to go through the whole interrogation all over again. Why is this important? Well, the inspector's goal is to force each member of the family to accept responsibility in some measure for the death of Eva Smith, and by the end of the play only the younger Burlings have done this. Sheila and Eric are devastated, while their parents don't really care, and Gerald sits somewhere in the middle. He gets close to accepting responsibility before deciding the whole affair isn't worth worrying about after all, Not even the bit where he cheated on his girlfriend with a homeless girl. He says, "Everything's all right now, Sheila. What about this ring?" So he clearly hasn't learnt anything more powerful than his own sense of denial. However, by going through the whole interrogation process again, it's suggested that the Burling family will have another opportunity to confront their own guilt and make a different choice. In a sense, time will repeat itself. So, we've got moments frozen in time at the end of each act, and time repeating itself at the end of the play. When you factor in the way the inspector mysteriously suggests he hasn't got much time himself, it becomes clear that J.B. Priestley is trying to make some sort of statement on the subject. In fact, An Inspector Calls has been called a time play. Time does some strange things in the play, and by playing with time, and leaving so many of the plot's riddles unanswered, Priestley forces the audience to ask themselves a lot of questions about what they've seen. This, in essence, is the ambiguity in the title of this video. Ambiguity is an important concept in An Inspector Calls. If something is ambiguous, that means it has more than one single meaning, and what is actually happening is open to interpretation. Now, this can cause GCSE pupils real stress, because we spend so much of life being told that there is one correct answer for everything. But that isn't the case here, and it's really important to relax and accept the idea that there are multiple possible meanings for lots of aspects of this play. Rather than thinking about the play like a jigsaw puzzle that needs finishing, think about it as a jigsaw where lots of the bits are missing, and you'll only ever be able to make an educated guess about what the completed picture looked like. So, going back to the idea of An Inspector Calls being a time play, what are those questions that we are unable to answer? Well, depending on who you are and how you interpret the narrative of the play, you could ask any of these. Is history repeating? Has something strange happened to time while the inspector has been at the house? Has time stopped while the inspector was at the house? Is that why the lighting changes? Why was the inspector in such a hurry? Is he trying to finish the questions before the girl kills herself? If he's not manipulating time, is the inspector psychic? Can he see the future? Furthermore, because of the way the inspector behaves, it becomes even harder to know exactly what takes place during the play. For example, because the inspector keeps all the characters separate when showing each of them the photo of the dead girl, it's impossible for the audience to know if he shows everyone the same photo or if they're all different. This raises even more ambiguity. Did the inspector show everyone the same photo? If he didn't, did they all see different photos or just some of them? If there is a dead girl in the mortuary, is it Eva Smith? If it's a different girl, will the Burlings still know her? Is there more than one Eva Smith? Does Eva Smith exist at all, or is it all a hoax? Once again, we can't really answer any of these with any certainty, but all these questions inevitably lead us to the most important question of all. If the inspector can either see the future or manipulate time, then what is he? Once again, there's no single correct answer to this question. There are a number of possible interpretations that can be applied to the character of Inspector Gould, some physical and others more supernatural. So, depending on how you read and interpret the play, Inspector Gould could be a real police officer who gives some incorrect details about himself or is from another police force than he says he is. He could be someone who knew Eva Smith. After all, he's read her diary and seems to know about her death before the authorities do. Or he could be an enemy of Mr. Burling's, or someone hired by one of Burling's enemies to scare or intimidate him. Those are just some of the real or physical options. Now come the supernatural possibilities, beginning with the most obvious, that he's some sort of ghost. The word ghoul describes an evil spirit, and he certainly behaves in ways that suggest he's more than human, and knows more about the Burlings than he should. However, some people have gone even further, by suggesting that the inspector could be God or even the devil, depending on whether you see him as a positive presence or not, or even a physical manifestation of each character's sense of guilt or moral responsibility. This idea that deep down inside, all the Burlings know they're horrible people and want to atone for their behaviour. If you look at the play like this, then the inspector becomes more of a priest figure, allowing each character to confess their darkest sins. To J.B. Priestley, it is not important that we find the right answer here, only that we ask the questions and discuss each possible meaning. Does it make a difference if Gould is a real police inspector or not? Well, it certainly made a difference to Mr. and Mrs. Burling, even if it didn't to Sheila and Eric. And if they can disagree, then why can't the audience? So it's very important not to get too hung up on the ambiguity in the play, because it's a gift that lets you accept whatever truth you want to, and write about the play however you want. However, there is one meaning of an inspector calls that isn't open to interpretation, and that is the political message contained in it. Beyond all the possibilities elsewhere in the play, the inspector is most definitely a dramatic device used by J.B. Priestley to put his socialist beliefs across to the audience. Though we can argue over the extent to which the inspector is a representation of J.B. Priestley himself, he definitely espouses Priestley's most valued beliefs as a socialist, and it's clear even before the inspector enters. Burling is clearly the inspector's antithesis, his opposite, and that's why he's wrong about everything he predicts before he gives his speech about how it's great to be selfish. Priestley wants us to judge Burling unfavourably from the start, so the inspector seems more virtuous and right by contrast. The inspector spends a great deal of the play making pointed comments about responsibility, such as when Mrs. Burling is blaming the father of the pregnant girl's child, or when Burling mentions he's a public man. He also goes out of his way to constantly remind the Burlings about the fact there is a dead woman lurking at the heart of this story. There is no doubt at all that the inspector wants to make the family feel guilty, and no doubt at all that Priestley wants his audience to ask the same questions of themselves, and also feel guilty if it's necessary or deserved. This is never more apparent than in the inspector's final speech, which lays out the writer's message as clear as day. But just remember this: one Eva Smith has gone, but there are millions and millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths still left with us, with their lives, their hopes and fears, their suffering and chance of happiness all intertwined with our lives, and what we think and say and do. We don't live alone. We are members of one body. We are responsible for each other, and I tell you that the time will soon come when if men will not learn that lesson, then they will be taught it in fire and blood and anguish. This is a really important speech to remember, because not only does it sum up Priestley's viewpoint, but it also tends to pop up in exam questions fairly regularly. The first part of this speech, the millions and millions and millions part, uses repetition for effect, to really hammer home how Eva Smith is an everyman figure. We don't live alone. We are members of one body. We are responsible for each other. Look how Priestley uses the word we here. On one level, that we is the inspector and the Burling family. On another level, it is a direct message from Priestley to everyone in the audience that they are all in this together. Finally, the fire and blood and anguish the inspector mentions before he leaves represents the rise of fascism and the two world wars that have occurred between the play taking place and Priestley writing it. Remember that Priestley was writing in 1945, when war had once again brought industry to a halt throughout Europe so that planes and weapons could be built, and food consumption was regulated with rationing. It was not a nice time to be alive. The inspector is predicting the future here, but unlike Mr. Burling, he's correct, because he's speaking with Priestley's voice, and Priestley, writing in 1945, has the luxury of already knowing what happened along with every member of the audience. As we mentioned before, an inspector calls has been called a time play, and it does behave a bit like a theatrical time machine in the way it enables Priestley to make such bold statements about where he believes humanity is headed. Ultimately, an inspector call stands as a direct call to every member of its audience to pick a side. Are you a selfish person, or do you believe in helping others? Are you part of the solution or part of the problem? And either way, what are you going to do about it? Thanks for watching. We hope you found this season on An Inspector Calls informative and helpful. Please feel free to leave any feedback you'd like us to read of the Click Revision website. Now that you've watched all the videos on An Inspector Calls, now would also be a good time to go back and revisit the questions at the end of each video and further develop the answers you've already given. But now, as always, try to write a few sentences in answer to each of these questions before you move on. Question 1. What are the most important structural features of An Inspector Calls? Question 2. Who or what is the inspector? Try to back up your ideas or opinions with evidence from the text. Question 3. What is the overall message of An Inspector Calls? Try to sum up what you think J.B. Priestley might have wanted his audience to take away when watching the play.